Li Jun had always been the kind of person who believed that time was just another variable to be controlled, like mass or velocity or the occasional misbehaving electron. As a physicist, she'd grown up on the idea that the universe was a grand equation waiting to be solved, an infinite series of numbers and patterns. So, when she returned to her childhood hometown of Springfield after 5 years away, it was with the same sense of curiosity that one might approach an old puzzle. What could have possibly changed in a town like this, where time seemed to drag on forever? But when she arrived, it was immediately clear that something was wrong. The first clue was the weather. It wasn't just the stifling humidity, typical of this time of year. No, it was the speed at which everything seemed to be moving. The wind whipped through the streets at an unnerving pace, trees shaking and rustling as if they were caught in a perpetual gust. People seemed to be moving faster, too, as though time itself had somehow been sped up. It was subtle at first, but then it became impossible to ignore. Li Jun's mother, who should have been in her late 50s, was now almost unrecognizably older, her face sagging and her movements slow. The old neighbor Mrs. Wei, who had always looked frail, appeared downright spry, younger than Li Jun remembered her from a year ago. As Li Jun walked into the house, she tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort. Her mother, sitting in the kitchen, greeted her with a strained smile, her eyes clouded with confusion. "You look different," her mother said, her voice cracking slightly. "You've been gone a long time, June. What's happening to this town?" The question echoed in Li Jun's mind. What was happening to the town? The time distortion was undeniable now. It was as if time was accelerating for everyone except a select few, and they didn't even realize it. Mrs. Wei was one of them. Her skin looked fresh and youthful, as if she had turned back the clock by a few decades, while Li Jun's own mother, the woman who had aged gracefully until now, seemed to be withering at a frightening pace. As Li Jun sat down at the kitchen table, she began to piece together the fragments of a mystery she wasn't yet ready to solve. The days that followed only deepened the strange, unsettling atmosphere of Springfield. People didn't seem to notice that time was moving faster than usual, or if they did, they didn't care. Li Jun had spent enough time away to know that the town had always had its share of quirks, but this was something entirely different. The clocks, when she bothered to look at them, seemed to be moving at an alarming speed. It wasn't just the weather or her mother's accelerated aging, it was the entire town, caught in the grip of an invisible force. Her initial assumption was that it was some kind of environmental anomaly, maybe a freak of nature or an experimental glitch, something tied to local industry or even some kind of bizarre natural disaster. But as she observed more closely, she realized it wasn't anything that could be explained by conventional science. This wasn't just a distortion of spacetime, it was something that had been happening for years, something that had seeped into the very fabric of Springfield, something insidious and deeply rooted. Li Jun had spent much of her academic life researching the nature of time itself. She was familiar with the theoretical concepts, time dilation, quantum fluctuations, the possibility of alternate timelines. But none of it seemed to explain what was happening here. If anything, it seemed like the acceleration of time wasn't a random event at all, it had a specific pattern, one that tied directly to her hometown and, more disturbingly, to her own life. That night, as Li Jun sat alone in the darkened living room of her childhood home, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. There was something out there, something pressing in from the edges of her perception, a whispering, invisible force that seemed to be playing with the very flow of time. And then it clicked. The church. The old town church on the hill, a place she had almost forgotten about. The church was an ancient structure, one that had stood long before her family had moved to Springfield. It was a relic, its history shrouded in rumors and myths. As a child, Li Jun had always been fascinated by it, sneaking up there to explore its dusty corners and forgotten rooms. Her mother had warned her to stay away from the church, saying that it was filled with old superstitions and that it was a place best left undisturbed. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, Li Jun had an unsettling feeling. The church, that crumbling edifice, was at the heart of everything. She decided to investigate. The next day, she walked up to the church. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, as she approached the building. It loomed over the town like a silent sentinel, its spires reaching toward the sky. The door creaked as she pushed it open, a sound that echoed through the empty halls. The musty smell of old wood and dust filled her nostrils, and for a moment, she wondered if she had made a mistake, but then she saw it. The artifact that it was tucked away in the back of the church, hidden behind a false wall, a relic of some long-forgotten era. The artifact was a large, intricately carved stone, almost spherical, with strange symbols etched into its surface. It had a low hum to it, a vibration that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. As Li Jun reached out to touch it, a surge of energy shot through her, and in that moment, she saw a vision of the town, sped up. People aging, decaying, and regenerating in quick succession, the fabric of reality bending in ways she couldn't quite comprehend. That was when she realized the truth. The artifact wasn't just a relic. It was the source of the time distortion. Somehow, in her childhood, she must have triggered it, her touch, her presence, and it had been active ever since, quietly accelerating time in the town. It was no accident that the people in Springfield were aging so rapidly or returning to their youth. It was all tied to this strange, otherworldly force. Li Jun spent the following days in a frenzy, trying to find answers. She spoke to the town's elders, some of whom were shockingly unaffected by the rapid aging, their bodies still in the prime of life. Mrs. Wei, of course, was one of them. But instead of offering answers, the elders only offered cryptic warnings, telling her to leave the church alone, to forget about the artifact, to live in the present and stop looking for trouble. But Li Jun wasn't the type to back down, especially when it came to science. She knew that the artifact's effects weren't just localized to Springfield, they had the potential to ripple outward, to affect the world at large. The more she delved into the church's history, the more she began to see patterns, ancient rituals, forgotten texts, and strange references to a timekeeper, a mythical figure said to be able to control the flow of time itself. But what did that mean for her? Was she somehow linked to this artifact? Was she the timekeeper, chosen by fate? As the days passed, the town continued to age, rapidly for some, and barely at all for others. Li Jun could no longer ignore the fact that her own abilities, her own connection to time, were at the heart of the disturbance. She had unknowingly triggered this cycle, and now she had to find a way to stop it before everything was lost. Li Jun hadn't expected it to be easy, but she certainly hadn't anticipated how quickly things were escalating. Every moment in Springfield felt heavier, as though time itself was drawing a thick, invisible rope around the town, tightening with every breath she took. The clock tower, the one that had always been the town's proud feature, seemed to be ticking too fast, its chimes ringing out with an urgency that set her nerves on edge. But it was the feeling of wrongness that gnawed at her, the deep, unshakable sense that the world had somehow gotten stuck in a loop that she couldn't break out of. The days blurred into one another, each one bringing with it more signs that the town's residents were living in borrowed time. The elderly were aging by the hour, their faces sinking into deep wrinkles as if they were wearing a mask of their former selves. And yet, there were those who appeared unchanged, even rejuvenated. Mrs. Wei, for example, was out in her garden, humming a tune, her skin smooth and her posture straight, as though she had turned back the years. Li Jun had visited her a few times since her discovery at the church, each time more concerned, but Mrs. Wei only offered vague responses, as though she were aware of something that Li Jun could not comprehend. The artifact, that stone, pulsed in her mind like a distant drumbeat, its rhythm synced with her every thought. It felt alive. It had been part of the town for as long as anyone could remember, hidden deep in the church, and yet she knew, without a doubt, that it was tied to her. One evening, after another long day of failed experiments, Li Jun stood in front of the mirror in her childhood bedroom, staring at her own reflection. The face that looked back at her was still young, vibrant, but something had changed in her eyes. She could see the wear and tear of the last few days reflected there, the sleepless nights, the gnawing anxiety, the deep sense of responsibility. She wasn't sure anymore if she was trying to solve a scientific mystery or trying to escape a fate she couldn't control. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the messages she'd sent to her colleagues, hoping for some breakthrough, some way out. But there was nothing. No answers. Just dead ends. Then, a knock on the door. Her mother entered, her face wrinkled and tired but still somehow warm. Li Jun could tell that her mother had been in the kitchen, preparing something. She always did when she was worried about her daughter. But tonight, there was something different in her eyes. "June," her mother said softly. "We need to talk." Li Jun nodded, setting her phone down. She motioned for her mother to sit, but before her mother could respond, Li Jun said, "I know what's happening. I know why time is speeding up here." Her mother's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The church. The artifact," Li Jun continued, feeling a coldness settle deep in her chest. "It's the source. It's me. Somehow, my connection to that place, to that thing, is causing all of this. The time distortion. The aging. Everything." Her mother didn't speak at first. She simply sat there, staring at her daughter with wide, frightened eyes. It was as if Li Jun had just told her that the world was ending, and she didn't know how to process it. "You're saying this is your fault?" her mother asked after a long pause. "You caused all of this?" "I didn't mean to," Li Jun said quickly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I was just a kid. I didn't know." Her mother didn't respond for a while, but the silence between them thickened. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight, but now that it was spoken, it felt like a burden too heavy to bear. Her mother looked down at her hands, as if trying to process the weight of what had just been revealed. "You need to stop this," her mother said finally, her voice soft but firm. "You need to go back to that church and find a way to put things right." Li Jun hesitated. She had already been there, had already seen the artifact, but she wasn't sure what else there was to find. The idea of going back filled her with dread, but it was clear her mother was right. If she didn't do something, time would continue to spiral out of control, and not just for Springfield, for everything. That night, Li Jun couldn't sleep. She paced around the house, trying to come up with a plan, but every option she considered seemed like a dead end. There was no precedent for something like this, no scientific explanation for why the flow of time seemed to be bending and breaking. The more she thought about the artifact, the more she felt that the truth was just out of reach. It was as if time itself was pushing her forward, forcing her into the next step, but she couldn't see where it was leading. The next day, Li Jun made up her mind. She couldn't wait any longer. If she was going to fix this, if she was going to stop the spiral, she had to face the artifact again. She had to understand it, control it. She had to find a way to break the cycle, even if it meant destroying the thing that had caused it all. When she reached the church that afternoon, she felt the familiar pulse of energy, as though the artifact was calling to her. It was as if the church itself were alive, the air thick with the weight of history and power. The doors creaked open as she stepped inside, the coolness of the stone walls wrapping around her like an old, forgotten memory. She made her way to the back, her footsteps echoing in the empty space, and there it was again, the artifact. It sat in its hidden alcove, glowing faintly, its surface shimmering with the strange symbols that she still couldn't read. Li Jun approached it slowly, almost reverently. She could feel its power, its pull, and she knew that she could not walk away without confronting it. This time, when she reached out to touch the stone, there was no flash of energy. There was only a deep, unsettling stillness. The hum of the artifact was gone, replaced by a silence so complete it felt as if the world had stopped moving. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and placed her hand against the stone's surface. The moment she did, everything changed. In an instant, she was no longer standing in the church. She was standing outside of time itself, suspended in a place where there were no clocks, no past, no future. It was a vast, empty space, dark, yet somehow alive, pulsing with an energy that she could feel in her bones. In front of her stood a figure, a woman whose face was both familiar and distant. She looked like Li Jun, but older, her face marked with the passage of countless years. Her eyes glowed with a deep, knowing light. "You are the timekeeper," the woman said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You are the one who must maintain balance. The artifact is not just a tool, it is part of you. It is part of your soul. You cannot destroy it, Li Jun. You must learn to control it." Li Jun's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to speak, but no words came. The woman's eyes softened, as if reading the confusion in her mind. "You were always meant to be the guardian," the woman continued. "Your touch awakened the artifact. And now, you must decide. Will you accept your destiny and restore balance, or will you let time slip into chaos?" Li Jun wanted to scream, to reject everything she was hearing, but the words stuck in her throat. This was too much. Too much to take in. She was just a scientist. She wasn't supposed to be a timekeeper. But then the world around her began to shift. The church reappeared, the walls solidifying around her, the air thick with the sense of inevitability. She was back in the church, standing before the artifact. But something had changed. She could feel it. The artifact was waiting for her to make a choice. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. There was no going back now. The time distortion, the aging, the acceleration, it was all connected to her, to the artifact. And if she didn't act, everything would be lost. "I accept," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I will restore balance." The artifact pulsed one last time, and in that moment, Li Jun felt time itself reset. The town, the people, everything, snapped back into place, the cycle broken. Li Jun stood frozen, her hand still resting on the artifact, the air around her vibrating with energy. The pulse that had coursed through her when she accepted the mantle of timekeeper seemed to reverberate in every cell of her body. It was as if her entire existence had aligned with the rhythm of the universe, the very fabric of time weaving itself into her consciousness. She opened her eyes, and everything around her seemed to shimmer, the church walls blurring, the flicker of light from the stained glass windows warping and twisting like a mirage. The sensation of being outside time itself was overwhelming. She had seen the future, felt the past, and now she was living in the moment, every second stretching and compressing with equal power. But the moment didn't last. Time, in its usual form, pushed back against her, snapping things back into place with a sudden jolt. She blinked, and the church was as it had always been, cold stone, empty silence, the faint smell of incense lingering in the air. The artifact sat before her, its glow now dim, as if exhausted by the energy it had released. Li Jun pulled her hand away, stumbling back slightly. She felt the weight of her choice settle over her like a mantle, and yet, there was no joy, no sense of accomplishment. Only a cold, gnawing emptiness. Had she really done it? Had she truly set things right? Or had she only postponed the inevitable? She looked around the church one last time. The walls, the altar, the dust-filled air, it all seemed so ordinary now. The magic, the distortion, had been banished, but the space felt still. Too still. As if time were now holding its breath, she left the church without looking back. There was nothing more to be done here, at least not for now. The town, as she'd left it, was silent. No longer in a state of frantic decay, but still and waiting. Waiting for something. She wasn't sure what it was, but she could feel it deep in her bones. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. It was never meant to be this simple. As Li Jun made her way home, she noticed the subtle changes immediately. The air felt lighter, the world less oppressive. The people in the streets, once haggard with age, now appeared more like themselves, no longer stuck in the limbo between youth and decay. The rapid, unnatural aging seemed to have stopped. But there was a certain unease in their eyes, as if they, too, could feel the weight of what had just transpired. She entered her mother's house, greeted by the familiar smell of simmering soup in the kitchen. Her mother, who had been deteriorating so quickly only days ago, now looked normal. Her hair was still graying, her face lined with age, but she seemed herself again. Not too old. Not too young. Just right, you're back, her mother said with a smile that was both relieved and cautious, as if she, too, were uncertain of what this moment meant. June nodded but didn't speak. Her mother, ever perceptive, noticed her silence. Did you do it? She asked, her voice low, careful. I think so, Li Jun replied, her voice distant. But I don't know what will happen now. Her mother gave her a long, searching look, then pulled her into a tight hug. For a moment, the weight of the past few days seemed to dissolve in her mother's embrace. The world had shifted, and in that moment, Li Jun realized just how much she had wanted it to end. She had been so focused on fixing the anomaly, on undoing the damage, that she hadn't allowed herself to process the changes in herself, in the people she loved. She hadn't fully accepted what this role as timekeeper meant for her, but as her mother pulled back, Li Jun saw it, the brief flash of uncertainty in her eyes. They both knew that things couldn't go back to how they were before. No matter how hard they tried to pretend, the threads of time that had been unraveled were not so easily mended. We'll make it work, her mother said, her voice steady despite the underlying fear. We always do. Li Jun nodded. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that time could be fixed, that everything could return to normal. But she knew better. Time, like any force of nature, was unpredictable. It didn't follow rules. It didn't care about intention or consequence. She had only delayed the inevitable. She had only pushed the storm further away, not stopped it. Over the next few days, life in Springfield settled into a strange kind of rhythm. People went about their routines, though the unease lingered. The elderly who had been aging so rapidly now seemed normal again, but their faces bore the marks of the years they had skipped. Mrs. Wei, for example, appeared to have aged a decade in a single day. She was still spry, but there was a gravity to her now, a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. As if the sudden return to her true age had left her stunned, unsure of what to do with her newfound time. And then there were the others, the ones who had remained unaffected, like Li Jun's mother. They didn't show the same signs of wear as the rest, and yet, they too seemed different, as if they were living in a world that wasn't quite their own anymore. Li Jun found herself slipping into old patterns. She visited the local library, pored over books about temporal anomalies, and searched for any scrap of knowledge that might explain what she had done. But every answer only led to more questions. There were no precedents for what had happened. No way to predict what might come next. And as the days passed, she found herself growing restless, her mind consumed by the uncertainty that still hung over the town like a shadow. It was during one of these late-night readings that she found it, a forgotten manuscript hidden deep within the library archives, its pages yellowed with age and its ink fading. It was written in an old dialect, one she could barely decipher, but the meaning was clear enough. The artifact, the stone, wasn't just a tool for manipulating time. It was a key that could unlock not just the flow of time in Springfield, but time itself. Li Jun's heart skipped a beat. If this was true, then the artifact wasn't something that could simply be destroyed or hidden away. It was a piece of something larger, something far beyond her understanding. And if it was a key, then the door it opened could lead to something unimaginable. The next morning, Li Jun returned to the church. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to it, as if some invisible force were urging her to return. When she stepped inside, the familiar weight of the artifact was there, but it didn't feel the same. It was dormant now, its power subdued, its glow almost gone. But Li Jun could still feel it, pulsing faintly beneath her fingertips. She took a deep breath and placed her hand on the stone once more. This time, she didn't wait for the flash of energy. She didn't need to see the visions or hear the warnings. She understood now. The artifact wasn't her enemy. It wasn't something to be feared or destroyed. It was part of her. Part of the fabric of the world. A force that needed to be respected and understood, not controlled. "I understand," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence of the church. "But I can't do this alone." For a long moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the silence profound. Then, very slowly, the artifact began to pulse again, its glow brighter this time. Li Jun stood there, not knowing what would come next, but ready to face whatever the future, and the past, held for her. She wasn't alone anymore. The power of the artifact, and the responsibility it carried, was hers. But the world wasn't the same anymore. Neither was she. She had become part of something larger. Something that was as old as time itself, and as the light from the artifact swirled around her, she knew one thing for certain: the story was far from over.